welcome everyone. We might make a start on the data privacy webinar. So this is the third one in the series, the final one. So if we just go to the next slide. And so what we looked at first was really around the data discovery, and we're just discussing about the exponential of data within an organization. And so then the second series looked at the challenges around data, where we interviewed David Messermann, which was a really good discussion around, some of the challenges from a legal point around how to manage privacy and governance. And today we'll be looking at really how do we develop a sustainable data framework that helps organizations to manage the roles and responsibilities. And with me, I have Rob Tyler, who's a cybersecurity director for Turnkey, and also Kum Fei, who's a principal sales engineer for BigID, being able to cover some of these aspects and topics. And I'll just hand it over to Rob now, and he'll take over from here.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the introductions. And thanks also for welcome, Kum Fei. So I guess it's our turn now. So myself and Kum Fei will cover off how do we make data protection sustainable. So that's I guess it's not just about addressing the current or most immediate need, but it's also about how do we ensure we understand the risk of sensitive data exposure, how do we manage it, and how do we adapt to the changing compliance and legal requirements that emerge over time. So later in the session, we'll also have Kum Fei share a demonstration of some of the key concepts we've discussed. All right, so let's take a look at what it takes to, actually apologies. We will aim to have about 5 minutes at the end of the webinar to take any questions and answer questions. So please enter questions into the Q&A box on the Zoom login, and we'll address those towards the end. All right, so let's take a look at what it takes to sustain data protection. So firstly, we need a data protection framework. A framework will set out the why, what, and how of how data protection applies to an organization. So sustainable data protection involves operationalizing the activities of data protection. So if we think about this, it's not just a one-off project with a start date and end date, but it's a set of practices that we build on over time and as needs change. So the other thing I'd say about sustained data protection is that it's iterative. If we think that we need to build an entire index or catalogue of all our sensitive data prior to actually starting to take some action, or if we need to define our policies at that granular level before we start to discover data and know what to do with it, we're actually going to really never get there. So it needs to be an iterative process, and it needs to be an iterative process that develops over time. And the same thing applies to the framework, which defines what it is we need to do. So this is something that will evolve over time as well, and it's something that will tune our practices around as we start to develop, I guess, better practices and learn more about what it takes to secure data within our organization. So to build out a sustainable framework, we need some fundamentals that actually underpin that. And first of those is funding. So funding in terms of a sustainable data protection program should be built for the long term, or should have long term in mind. So it's not just a project, and it's not just not funding for a single iteration. It's actually what does it take, or what is the level of commitment that the organisation requires to reduce and maintain the level of risk of sensitive data over the long term. So we've discussed in previous webinars with Richard and David on what are the financial impact of data breach. So this is something that unfortunately, at least here in Australia, we're getting a good view of what that impact can be. So the costs, for example, can be around compensation. Now most of the, or I think all of the large breaches we've experienced here in Australia, most have some form of class action underway. So there's compensation, there's cost of defending class actions or legal action. There's the cost of actually responding to the breach of sensitive data. There's a loss of revenue. There's also damage to reputation that has some form of cost associated. So there are these costs that we can obviously consider in terms of building out a justification for funding a data framework or sustainable data protection framework. So I guess and another thing that occurs to me is that in David's conversation, he mentioned that the C-suite in terms of their reputation actually also is something that they can carry with them in longer term. So from a pure self-interest perspective, there's an incentive here for C-level managers to actually invest in managing sensitive data at a manageable level. A question over to you, Richard, to bring to tie in previous webinars. So, there are plenty of justification in terms of the cost side of how we justify investment in sustainable data protection. So I'm keen to get your input from your experience about what are the other things that we can, what are the other avenues we can feed into this cost justification?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And a lot of the focus has been negative in terms of, regulation, you get a fine if you don't do it, reputation and branding. And, even from regulation point of view, $56,000 fine for a data breach is not enough to encourage, spending on particular these areas. But there's also a positive side that, if organizations understand that data is growing exponentially and, a few hundred applications at most organizations, and your customer data or your vendor data, personal data is scattering further and across all these applications. And the key to it is not going to go away. And being able to understand that and to manage it and archive where you archive. In the case of, Latitude Finance recent data breach, they've taken driver's licenses and other things, and having good policies in place that sort of secure that and put that aside and say, yes, we only need to validate once, but we do need to have for a legal reason. Let's just lock that away. But for other information, such as customer information, where we do need to understand what they're buying, their trends, whether it's in a bank or even a manufacturing, and how can we use that data? And once you put the governance framework and you identify where your sensitive data is, then you can able to manage it with the right processes in terms of, the tools, classification, and making sure only people that need to have access to it have it. Then you can actually get a lot more value. And that should be one of the value propositions for really driving this funding.
All right. Thanks, Richard. So, so I guess with the appropriate guardrails in place and where stakeholders understand, I guess, what they can do with data, and we can see more value from that data. I think it's fair to say that right now in Australia at least, that there would be some uncertainty about what is a sensitive data? What do we do with it? How can we use it? So giving some certainty actually gives us more value in that data for the organisation. So next we have buy-in. So data protection involves a lot of stakeholders across the organisation. And data protection is an organisation-wide responsibility. So it's not just an IT problem, nor is it just a legal problem, and neither of these stakeholders or groups within an organisation can actually solve this problem alone. So it takes actually everyone's cooperation, whether it's frontline workers, whether it's application owners or business unit decision makers, senior managers, IT, legal, as I mentioned. Everyone actually has a role to play in data protection. And in some cases, it takes effort, and it takes input and effort from some stakeholders in the process. So for this, we need their buy-in, and this is necessary, to essentially compete for their time and attention against the dozen other initiatives that are going on at any one time. So we need to, we need to ensure that we have adequate attention. So something that David actually mentioned in this is worthwhile reminding as well, in that he used a stat of 8 to 9% of those impacted by identity theft actually consider suicide. So this is it's a stark, it's an alarming statistic. But it's also a reminder that protection of PII, at least, and sensitive data actually has a personal, it can be deeply personal. So it has a connection to, and it has the clear, can have a clear impact on actually actual people. So I think reminding stakeholders of the bigger picture and the long-term impact is something we can also remind stakeholders of what it is we're doing and why we're doing this. And that goes beyond, protecting either their part of the organisation or the organisation more broadly from the damages of data breach. So we also need awareness. So I think it's fair to say, at least in Australia, we're as a population wide, we're way more aware now of the need to protect personal information. We're way more aware of what is sensitive data, and the need for protecting it, both within our day-to-day lives and as within our working capacity of what it is that the importance of protecting data. I think when we see what looks like sensitive data, we're obviously more aware that this is something that we needs appropriate protection, and we need to consider how we're using it. So just as we have cyber awareness, we also have data protection awareness, and this is this becomes part of an ongoing iterative kind of awareness development that's required as part of sustainable data protection. And lastly, we have automation. So we need to leverage the technology that's available to us. So this includes platforms that are specifically built around the challenges of data protection, or built specifically for protecting data. So these platforms provide us the opportunity to discover data, in the areas where we're not aware data exists, to build a catalogue, or at least an index of all that sensitive data. It also helps us to build some context about that data and perhaps why it's sensitive. It can include, in some cases, AI to help build some context or build insight into that data. It also assists us in the workflows about what do we do about this data? How do we take remediation action if this is sensitive data that needs protecting? So I've got a question for Kumfei here. So I guess in your experience with client conversations, if there's not, a purpose-built platform that can do this discovery work, what else have you seen clients attempting to do to build out this catalogue of sensitive data and to identify it?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Rob. So what we've seen with existing customers as well as prospects that we've spoken to is probably very common among customers and attendees here today as well, is a combination of running semi-automated scripts around batch files, SQL queries, etc., and then running keyword search across the data sources in an attempt to find out what data they have and where it is, right? And the challenges you have around those, I'm sure the attendees here will be well aware. It's all about scalability, right? Accuracy, as well as the ability, agility, right? Being able to respond to new data sources, new regulations, right? Essentially, it is unsustainable in the long run, because what you're looking for is the results that they have will be something as simple as, yes, we know we have 100,000 credit card numbers in a specific file, but we don't know much beyond that. Do you know, are those real credit card numbers? Do you know they actually belong to a user? So there's no context around that as well. And that's one of the biggest struggles that companies have with trying to basically understand their data.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, so for me, it's it's once we have that index of data, we also have the ability to adapt. If we need another view on that data, that index is there for and can adapt without, for example, just rediscovering the entire data set. So what is a data protection framework, and what does it consist of? So firstly, a framework should define the contribution of people, process, and technology. So each of these needs to be combined within the framework. So if we're relying on a silver bullet such as a technology platform to solve the challenge of data protection, then alone, then this won't happen. Data protection platforms are there to support the model and to model the framework. They're there to align with what people and process also need to contribute. They're not there to replace people and process. I think if we have an over reliance on a platform, this is a clear sign that the data protection program we have in place is really seen as an IT problem rather than an organisation-wide problem. And this is not the right way to address, or not the right level even to address data protection. So what does it consist of? This is not a definitive list, but a data protection framework consists of guiding principles, policies that should be accessible to all, everyone that needs to understand what their role is and how they apply data protection. It should be accessible at the right level of detail. So in terms of principles, we have the 7 GDPR principles or privacy principles. We've got 13 privacy principles in Australia. So these can be used as guidance or input into the principles for a data protection framework. The thing to keep in mind is that these were built from the protection of personal information perspective, from an individual looking out. So they're not necessarily well aligned for an organisation. They certainly, our guiding principles should certainly include them and take them into account, but we should also consider principles from the organisation perspective as well. So in addition to the definition, the framework also defines operational processes of data protection. So I'll talk to three different operational processes. The first of this is data inventory. So data inventory, as we've just heard recently from Kumfei, is to build that index of sensitive data. So that index of sensitive data is essentially retrieved from all sources of data within the organisation. It attempts to add some context to that, some ownership. It applies, where applicable, it tries to add some, linkage of that data. If, for example, unstructured data, it attempts to link that back to the original source of that data to add some further context. So in terms of sources of data, this is essentially everything, all sources of data. And in most cases, and probably most importantly, it's the source of data that we're unaware of, or the data we're unaware of from these sources. So that can be unstructured, structured, cloud hosted, within ERP and business apps, for example. Also within new applications or new initiatives. So in our DevSecOps cycle, we're defining new data for an organisation. We certainly need to be aware of, what are the implications of this new data? Is it sensitive? What do we do about it if it is? What are the appropriate protections? And we should be tracking that during that DevOps cycle as well, and having certain checkpoints to say, is this appropriate handling of sensitive information? So another question for Kumfei. So based on your experience, how have you seen organisations, structure or approach this seemingly kind of unattainable task of finding all or creating this index of all the sensitive data within an organization? What's the approaches you've seen taken?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations, what they've kind of done is essentially to understand the first principle of not trying to boil the ocean. You have a lot of data that you need to scan, especially for those that maybe have been a little bit slow, right, to start on that journey. But don't boil the ocean, break it down into achievable kind of pieces or bite sizes, where you focus on your most what do you call important data, right? That there's a risk angle to it, right, of the data, and then the sensitivity angle of the data, and you focus on the one that has the highest risk, highest sensitivity. You run a scan, you run a discovery to understand what's in there. You make a determination whether there's any immediate remediation that needs to be done on that first 10, 20% of your data sources, maybe, and then you move on to the next one. And that way, you essentially you start locking up, right, the doors and windows in that room or in the house, right, to basically increase the security and the privacy protection around it. But the most important thing is you got to start, right? And I would say that a lot of organizations also realize that where they know or they think they know their data is, like the customer databases, your CRMs, transaction, those are the known data sources, right? While they are high risk in the sense that they know what data is in there, sometimes it's the unknown, your shared folders, your external facing sharing platforms, etc. That actually is a little bit more of a concern because you're not quite sure what you're putting in there. So I think the first approach is basically to review what you have, identify that first tier of data sources you want to tackle, right? Get started on those and basically do a first scan, find out what you have, do the first level of remediation, and then you either do a second scan or you move on to the second tier of data sources.
Excellent. All right. So thanks, and it leads well into the next process, which is manage risk. So managing risk, aligned with Kumfei's suggestion around the highest sensitivity first. So getting a view on what is the current risk levels, and then prioritizing, within a platform, prioritizing what is the data that needs to be treated or remediated first. It's also around what is the current organizational wide risk level, and also importantly, risk over time. Are we making improvements? Are we drawing down some of this risk to manageable levels, or, for example, is that risk trending up, and what's the reason for that? And then lastly, it's to take action. It's to actually remediate that data, and whether that's encrypting it, whether that's secure, destroying the data, whether it's masking, all those activities. Which brings us to a good segue for a short demo. And actually recall in David's presentation, his advice was to, where there was data that was, I guess, had an unknown source, perhaps unknown whether it's still required. His advice is, put it out of reach. Make sure it's still accessible, but put it out of reach. So I guess, Kumfei, if you could give us a view on what that might look like on the platform, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Rob. So you should be able to see the BigID screen and see a data overview, right? So this demo environment, small demo environment, we've done the scan, we've done the classification to get a clear understanding of what our data landscape is, right? So you kind of know what data you have. You have information around things like which are your top data sources. My finance application seems to have a lot of data, a lot of findings, followed by network file share, not surprising. But one of the most important things that the data overview or a catalog like this can provide you, right, is essentially, right, the ability to identify, do I have any potential issues, right? So you can see already here, they've got a total of 47 violated policies. You can set up policies to identify data that is in the wrong location or sensitive information that has been shared with third parties, for example. So BigID allows you to identify a policy that basically says, I've got sensitive data, high sensitive data, right? Okay, and maybe I have the ability then to say, hey, I want to find any sensitive information, right, that has violated a policy that basically say high sensitivity data, right, and has been shared externally, right? So shared with third parties outside your organization through your OneDrive, to your SharePoint, etc., right? And you will be able to see, well, we can zoom right in. You've got 501 findings, right? So the first part is always to understand your data, right? And then identify potential gaps or potential violations, right, that you're going to be interested in. So essentially, know your data, find something. Do you have issues you need to look at? That's the first part. And as Rob mentioned just now, right, finding out and knowing that you've got potential issues there is the first part. It's not the end of it. You need to be able to do something about that. And that's what tools like BigID can help you with as well. We have a remediation app that allows you to basically drive that process of remediation. You found something. Now what you need to do is to basically reach out to the data source owner or the data object owner, right, and say, hey, John, you've got some information, some documents that are owned by you, right, or they are responsible for, and they are potentially in violation of corporate policies, right? You can take a look at that. And so the data owner can come in and take a look at the objects that they're responsible for. And we'll just pick one here, right, and say, well, so what's wrong with this document, right? So why is it flagged as well, a potential policy violation? We've done the discovery, we can understand what's in there. So this is a document, it's obviously a CV, right? It's got certain attributes like personal information, PII, etc., that may be in there, right? Right. And the reason why it's been flagged is got what you call external access. It's been shared with a third party, right? You can take a look at the policy that is potentially in violation of. But what we're trying to do is to allow the data object owner to then decide what should be done with it. So you can make a simple annotation that says, okay, this document needs to be encrypted because it is sensitive, right? Or you may need to basically archive it somewhere else, move it somewhere else. If the organization has a workflow, a ticketing system already in place, you can drive things like creating a JIRA ticket, right? Or you can request an exception because there's a legitimate business justification, right? So the whole idea here is to be able to take an action on that finding, okay? But you can't drive this unless you know about potential exceptions. And that's where the whole discovery classification engine comes in as well. Right, and just one more thing, okay, is that the ability to identify what you have about a user. One of the key capabilities of tools like BigID, right, is the ability to perform what we call correlation, to understand your data, what you have about a specific user, right, to be able to support privacy programs around things like data subject access requests, for example, right? So because BigID knows what data you have and who it belongs to, we can easily help you to generate a report that may look like this, a DSAR report for the requester that essentially tells you, okay, or allows the enterprise to be able to respond to a DSAR request and tell, in this case, Mr. Benjamin Terry Young, okay, Mr. Young, this are the different information that we hold about you, and whether you have any purpose of use around it as well, we can include those. And of course, you can do things like masking the data so that you don't present another risk level by putting things like your health number, your Medicare card number, etc., in clear text, right? So you can generate a simple and very quick and accurate DSAR report using the same inventory, right, that you basically created by leveraging BigID's data discovery and classification capabilities, right? So that's just a quick overview of what BigID can kind of help you with the discovery and classification. And I'm going to just hand it back to Rob.
Great, thanks, Config. Appreciate that. So I guess this wraps up our webinar. So we've shared what it takes or what makes up a sustainable data protection framework. The key point is that it's iterative, right? It's something that we build up over time. It's not something we need to do in one big bang. It's something that builds over time as we develop our practices and we start to learn more about what it takes to to secure an organisation of its sensitive data. And then the fundamentals are, we need funding, we need the buy-in, we need awareness of all stakeholders, and we need to leverage platforms and tools specifically for this purpose, which is automated, and that gives us the ability to adapt as needs change. So I'd like to now to open up to questions. I have one in the list from Hannah. There's any advice on how to initiate a conversation with senior management to invest in data privacy? That's a good question. So I think we've given some general advice about how to, I guess, build a funding case. I guess the first advice I'd give is that it needs to be in context for organisations. So it needs to initiate the conversation, you need to understand, I guess, sensitive data that is specific to that organisation and the specific risks that organisation is exposed to. Not only that, but that it can be addressed through a data protection framework. So I guess that's my advice: is not necessarily treat it as a generic approach, but quite specifically around what is the type of sensitive data organisation. It may be an organisation, for example, that doesn't have a lot of PII type data, not necessarily customer facing, but wholesale business, for example. So therefore, there are other sources of PIR data or sensitive data. HR, for example, contains a lot of sensitive data on employees. So there are certainly pockets of sensitive data, and they need adequate protection. So the advice would be to understand that and present that in terms that senior management are going to understand. All right, no other questions. So I guess I'd like to thank Richard Kumfei for the webinar series. I hope it's been a benefit. I'd like to thank everyone that's joined for your interest. And if you have any questions or like a demo, big data, or like some advice around assessment, feel free to contact us, and we can get that. We can certainly assist. So thanks, everyone.